In a peaceful little neighborhood where the air always smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, life moved at a pace that seemed almost too slow for the modern world. The streets were lined with modest homes, each one painted, in cheerful colors, their front yards decorated with flower beds or small vegetable patches. People here knew each other by name, waved hello when they passed on the sidewalk, and often shared homemade cookies or pies just because it felt like the right thing to do. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes without helmets, dogs napped lazily under shade trees, and everyone seemed to have all the time in the world. At the heart of this tranquil community lived an elderly woman named Evelyn Harper. Mrs. Harper, as everyone affectionately called her, was a fixture in the neighborhood. She had been living in her cozy little house for over 40 years, ever since her husband passed away and left her to navigate life alone. But despite her solitude, she never let loneliness creep into her days. Instead, she filled them with purpose, tending to her garden, taking long morning walks and chatting warmly with anyone who crossed her path. Her smile was genuine, her voice soft but steady, and her presence brought comfort to those around her. Mrs. Harper's home stood out not because it was grand or extravagant, but because of the love poured into every corner of it. Her front yard was a riot of color, bursting with marigolds, daisies, and roses that she pruned and watered herself every single day. Neighbors often joked that her flowers looked healthier than most people's houseplants, thanks to her green thumb and unwavering dedication. Inside, her house was equally inviting, a mix of old-fashioned charm and personal touches. Photographs of family gatherings lined the walls, knitted blankets draped over the furniture, and the scent of lavender potpourri lingered in every room. It wasn't fancy, but it was undeniably warm. Every morning, rain or shine, Mrs. Harper could be seen, walking down the street with her trusty wooden cane. She moved slowly but deliberately, savoring the crispness of the air and the sounds of birds chirping overhead. These walks weren't just about exercise. They were her way of staying connected to the world around her. Along the way, she'd stop to admire someone's new porch swing, compliment a neighbor on their freshly painted fence, or simply exchange pleasantries with passers-by. To many, these interactions might have seemed trivial, but to Mrs. Harper, they were what made life rich and meaningful. What most people didn't realize, however, was that beneath her gentle exterior lay a lifetime of resilience. Born during Indor, a time when women were expected to stay silent and submissive, Mrs. Harper had defied expectations at every turn. As a young girl, she had excelled in school, earning scholarships that allowed her to pursue higher education, a rarity for women of her generation. Later, as a wife and mother, she balanced raising 2 children with volunteering at local charities and advocating for social causes close to her heart. Even after losing her husband unexpectedly, she refused to let grief consume her. Instead, she channeled her energy into helping others, becoming a pillar of strength for her community. Despite her accomplishments, Mrs. Harper remained humble. She rarely spoke about her past achievements, preferring instead to focus on the present moment. To her neighbors, she was simply Mrs. Harper, the sweet elderly woman who baked banana bread for church fundraisers and always remembered everyone's birthdays. Few suspected that behind her calm demeanor lay a sharp mind, a fierce determination, and a wealth of untold stories. Her routine was predictable yet comforting. After her morning walk, she would spend hours in her garden, pulling weeds and planting new bulbs. By noon, she'd retreat indoors to prepare a light lunch, often accompanied by classical music playing softly in the background. In the afternoons, she might visit a friend, attend a book club meeting, or work on one of her many knitting projects. And in the evenings, she'd sit by her window, sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky. Life was simple, predictable, and beautiful in its own quiet way. But even in such a serene setting, trouble sometimes found its way in. Though the neighborhood prided itself on being safe and friendly, no place was entirely immune to mischief. Occasionally, there were whispers of petty crimes, missing bicycles, graffiti on walls, or loud disturbances late at night. Most residents shrugged these incidents off as isolated events, assuming they'd blow over soon enough. But deep down there was an unspoken fear that something bigger might happen someday. Little did anyone know, that day was closer than they thought, and it would involve none other than Mrs. Evelyn Harper herself. As fate would have it, the tranquility of the neighborhood was about to be disrupted in a way no one could have anticipated. What started as an ordinary afternoon stroll for Mrs. Harper would soon spiral into an unforgettable encounter, one that would reveal hidden strengths, test courage, and remind everyone that appearances can be deceiving. For now, though, life carried on as usual, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. On a bright and sunny afternoon, the neighborhood basked in the kind of weather that made people want to step outside and enjoy the day. Birds chirped cheerfully from the trees, children played tag on the sidewalks, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers filled the air. Mrs. Harper, true to her routine, set out for her daily walk shortly after finishing her morning gardening. She slipped on her favorite wide-brimmed hat to shield herself from the sun, grabbed her trusty wooden cane, and stepped out onto the pavement with a small smile. The world felt calm, peaceful, and safe, as it always did during these moments, she strolled down the tree-lined street. Mrs. Harper couldn't help but notice how vibrant everything looked. The flowers in her neighbor's yard seemed to glow under the sunlight, their colors more vivid than usual. She paused briefly to admire a patch of sunflowers swaying gently in the breeze before continuing on her way. Her pace was slow but steady, each step deliberate as she leaned slightly on her cane for support. Though her body wasn't as strong as it used to be, her spirit remained unshaken, and she took pride in maintaining her independence despite her age. A few blocks away, near the edge of the park where kids often flew kites or played soccer, 3 young men lounged lazily on a bench. They were known troublemakers, local teens who had earned a reputation for causing mischief wherever they went. Their names weren't important. What mattered was their behavior. From stealing bikes left unlocked outside homes to vandalizing public property with crude graffiti, they thrived on disrupting the peace of the otherwise quiet community. Today, however, they appeared idle, lounging around with bored expressions, waiting for something or someone to entertain them. Mrs. Harper didn't think much of them as she approached the park. She'd seen them hanging out there before, though she usually avoided crossing paths if she could help it. Something about their demeanor made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Still, she told herself not to jump to conclusions. After all, they were just boys. Misguided perhaps, but surely not beyond redemption. With that thought in mind, she kept walking, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of her cane tapping against the pavement. The trio noticed her almost immediately. At first, they exchanged glances, amused by the sight of the frail-looking elderly woman making her way down the street. One of them, a tall, lanky boy with messy hair, snickered quietly, nudging his friends. "Check it out," he said, pointing toward Mrs. Harper. "Look at Grandma over there, taking her sweet time." His comment drew chuckles from the other two. The second boy, shorter and stockier, smirked. "Bet she's got candy in that purse of hers," he joked. "Or maybe some cash for bingo night." The third member of the group, the apparent leader, based on his commanding tone, grinned wickedly. "Let's find out," he suggested, his voice dripping with mischief. Without another word, the 3 stood up from the bench and began sauntering toward Mrs. Harper, their intentions clear. Unaware of the danger lurking behind her, Mrs. Harper continued her leisurely stroll. She was lost in thought, reminiscing about the old days when her own children were young and would beg her to take them to this very park. Back then, life had been so different, full of noise, laughter, and endless energy. Now the silence was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed her to reflect, yes, but it also left her vulnerable to the unexpected. Suddenly, she heard footsteps quickening behind her. Before she could turn around to see who it was, she felt a sharp tug on her arm. Startled, she stumbled forward, nearly losing her balance. Her purse slipped from her shoulder, landing in the hands of one of the boys, the tall, lanky one who had first noticed her. He held it up triumphantly, grinning like he'd just won a prize. "Hey!" Mrs. Harper exclaimed, her voice trembling with shock and indignation. "Give that back. That's mine." But instead of complying, the boy laughed cruelly, tossing the purse to one of his friends. The second boy caught it effortlessly, holding it high above his head as if daring her to try and retrieve it. Meanwhile, the third boy, the leader, stepped closer, his expression smug and mocking. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" he taunted, giving her a light push on the shoulder. Though the shove wasn't forceful enough to knock her over, it was enough to make her stagger backward. Instinctively, she reached out to steady herself, gripping her cane tightly. Her heart raced, and for a moment, fear gripped her. These boys were bigger, stronger, and faster than she was. What chance did she have against them? For a brief second, anger flared within her. Anger at their audacity, their cruelty, and their complete disregard for basic human decency. But just as quickly as it came, the emotion faded, replaced by a deep sadness. How had things come to this? When did respect for elders become a thing of the past? Shaking her head slightly, she tried again, her voice firmer this time. "Please," she said, looking directly at the leader. "That purse has my wallet, my keys, and my medication. You don't understand how much I need those things." Her plea fell on deaf ears. The boys only laughed harder, clearly enjoying themselves. The leader smirked, taking a step back as if to mock her further. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about carrying so much stuff around," he sneered. Then, with a final glance at his accomplices, he motioned for them to leave. Together they turned and ran off, disappearing into the distance with her belongings still clutched tightly in their hands. Mrs. Harper stood there for a moment, rooted to the spot. Her breathing was shallow, her legs felt weak, and her mind struggled to process what had just happened. For years, she had lived in this neighborhood without incident, trusting that her kindness and goodwill would be reciprocated. Now, that trust felt shattered, leaving her shaken and unsure of what to do next. As she slowly regained her composure, she realized she needed help. But who could she turn to? Most of her neighbors were either at work or busy with their own lives. Besides, even if someone were nearby, would they intervene in time? Doubt crept into her thoughts, weighing heavily on her already fragile state. Still, she knew she couldn't give up, not yet. Summoning whatever strength she had left, she straightened her posture, adjusted her hat, and began walking back toward her home, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, had witnessed the theft and would come to her aid. Little did she know, fate had already intervened. Unbeknownst to her, or to the boys who now celebrated their petty crime, a pair of eyes had been watching everything unfold. Someone who wouldn't stand idly by while an innocent woman was treated so callously. Someone who believed in justice, fairness, and standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. That someone was none other than Vin Diesel, the Hollywood action star whose imposing physique and commanding presence were matched only by his sense of morality. Vin had been jogging through the neighborhood, enjoying the fresh air and stretching, his legs after spending hours cooped up indoors. He hadn't planned on encountering any drama today. He simply wanted to clear his head. But when he saw the commotion near the park, the boys snatching the purse, the elderly woman stumbling, and the cruel laughter that followed, he stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and his eyes narrowed with barely contained fury. Without hesitation, Vin jogged over to Mrs. Harper, his large frame casting a shadow over her petite figure. Kneeling down beside her, he spoke softly, his deep voice carrying a reassuring warmth. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Did they hurt you?" Mrs. Harper blinked, startled by the sudden appearance of the stranger. At first she didn't recognize him, too overwhelmed by the events of the past few minutes to focus on anything else. But as her gaze met his concerned expression, she nodded weakly. I think so," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They took my purse." "I know," Vin replied, his tone firm but kind. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll handle this." With that, he rose to his full height, his towering frame exuding an aura of authority that demanded respect. Turning his attention toward the direction the boys had fled, he set off at a brisk pace, determined to right the wrong he had witnessed. Back at the abandoned lot where they had retreated to divide their spoils, The three boys remained oblivious to the storm heading their way. They laughed and joked, rifling through the contents of Mrs. Harper's purse with reckless abandon. To them, this was just another harmless prank, a way to pass the time and assert their dominance over the weaker members of society. But as fate would have it, they were about to learn a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of someone willing to fight for what's right. Vin Diesel moved with purpose, his strides long and deliberate as he followed the trail of the three troublemakers. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger at their cruelty, concern for Mrs. Harper's well-being, and a fierce determination to set things right. Despite his fame and success, Vin had always prided himself on being grounded, someone who cared deeply about fairness and justice. This wasn't just about retrieving a stolen purse. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. As he jogged through the neighborhood, Vin's sharp eyes scanned the area, picking up on subtle clues that pointed him in the right direction. He noticed scuff marks on the pavement where the boys' sneakers had kicked up dirt, and faint echoes of their laughter drifted toward him from somewhere ahead. It didn't take long for him to pinpoint their location, an abandoned lot tucked behind an old warehouse, a place notorious for attracting mischief makers and vandals. The space was overgrown with weeds, littered with broken bottles and surrounded by rusted chain-link fences. Perfect for hiding out, but not enough to escape Vin's notice. Approaching cautiously, Vin slowed his pace, careful not to alert the trio prematurely. From a distance, he could see them huddled together near a crumbling brick wall, still engrossed in examining the contents of Mrs. Harper's purse. Their body language screamed arrogance. They leaned casually against the wall, passing items back and forth with smug grins plastered across their faces. They were completely unaware that they were being watched, let alone by someone who wouldn't tolerate their behavior for another second. Vin took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to come. He knew he had two options: call the police immediately or confront the boys directly. While involving law enforcement was undoubtedly the smarter choice, something inside him urged him to handle this personally. These young men needed more than just punishment. They needed a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. With that thought firmly planted in his mind, Vin stepped forward, emerging from the shadows into plain view. The sudden appearance of a towering figure caught the boys off guard. At first they froze, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Was that Vin Diesel? The same Vin Diesel whose face adorned movie posters and magazine covers worldwide? Surely not. But as he drew closer, there was no mistaking it. His muscular, frame-chiseled jawline and intense gaze left no room for doubt. For a brief moment, the boys stared at him in stunned silence, their bravado momentarily shattered. "Well, well," Vin said, his voice low and commanding, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Looks like I found you." The leader of the group, the one who had taunted Mrs. Harper earlier, was the first to recover. He straightened up, trying to mask his unease with a cocky smirk. "What's it to you, man?" he shot back, attempting to sound tough despite the obvious intimidation radiating from Vin's presence. "We didn't do anything wrong." "Didn't do anything wrong?" Vin repeated, raising an eyebrow. His tone was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that sent shivers down the boys' spines. Stealing an elderly woman's purse isn't anything wrong? Pushing her around for kicks isn't anything wrong? The leader faltered, his confidence wavering under Vin's unwavering stare. "It was just a joke," he muttered defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's fine, ain't she?" "A joke?" Vin echoed, his voice rising slightly now. Though he remained composed, the anger simmering beneath the surface was palpable. "Do you even realize how scared she was? How vulnerable she felt? That woman has lived a lifetime, raised a family, contributed to her community, and you treated her like she was nothing, like her dignity meant nothing." By now, the other two boys had backed away slightly, exchanging nervous glances. They weren't used to being confronted like this, especially not by someone who looked like he could bench press a truck without breaking a sweat. One of them, a wiry kid with shaggy hair, tried to lighten the mood with a weak laugh. "Come on, dude, we were just messing around, no harm done, right?" "No harm done," Vin repeated, taking a step closer. His movements were deliberate, measured, each step amplifying the tension in the air. "You think taking someone's belongings, humiliating them, and leaving them shaken is no harm done? Let me tell you something. You don't get to decide what's harmless and what's not. Not when it comes to treating people with respect." At this point, the boys were visibly rattled. The leader shifted uncomfortably, clutching the purse tighter as if it might offer some form of protection. "Look, man, we're sorry, all right?" he said quickly, though his apology sounded hollow. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble." Vin crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unyielding. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he said firmly. "Actions have consequences. You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to normal. What you did today was wrong. Plain and simple, and you need to make it right." For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. The boys exchanged uneasy looks, clearly unsure of what to do next. Finally, the leader hesitated before holding out the purse, his hands trembling slightly. "Here," he mumbled, avoiding Vin's gaze. "Take it." Vin didn't move immediately. Instead, he studied the boy's face, searching for sincerity, or at least a hint of remorse. When he was satisfied that the gesture was genuine, he reached out and took the purse, his grip firm but controlled. "Good choice," he said simply, tucking the bag under his arm. Then after a beat, he added, "But we're not done here." The boys tensed, their fear returning in full force. They glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of confusion and dread. "What else do you want from us?" the leader asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "I want you to understand why what you did was unacceptable," Vin replied, his tone softening slightly but still carrying weight. "I want you to think about how your actions affect others, not just today but every day. Being strong doesn't mean pushing people around, it means using your strength to protect those who can't protect themselves. Got it?" The boys nodded mutely, too intimidated to argue or protest further. Vin held their gaze for a few more seconds, ensuring his words sunk in, before turning on his heel and walking away. As he retraced his steps back toward Mrs. Harper's house, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just retrieved the stolen property. He'd planted a seed of reflection in the minds of 3 misguided youths. Whether or not that seed would grow remained to be seen, but at least he'd tried. When Vin returned to where Mrs. Harper was waiting, she looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. She had been sitting on a nearby bench, clutching her cane tightly as tears glistened on her cheeks. Seeing him approach with her purse in hand brought an immediate sense of relief. "You got it back," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you." Vin smiled warmly, kneeling beside her once again. "Of course, ma'am," he said gently, placing the purse in her lap. "No one should have to go through what you did today. Are you sure you're okay?" Mrs. Harper nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I'll be fine," she assured him, though her voice betrayed lingering vulnerability. It's been a long time since I've felt so helpless. I never imagined something like this could happen here." "I know," Vin replied, sympathetically. "But listen to me. You showed incredible courage today. Standing your ground, speaking up, it takes guts, especially when you're outnumbered. Don't ever forget that." His words seemed to lift some of the heaviness from her shoulders, and she managed a small, grateful smile. "You're very kind," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." "That's not true," Vin countered, shaking his head. "There are good people everywhere. Sometimes all it takes is one person stepping up to remind us of that." He paused, then added, "If you don't mind, I'll stay with you until we make sure the authorities are involved. We need to report this properly." Mrs. Harper hesitated briefly but eventually agreed, appreciating the reassurance Vin offered. Together, they waited for the police to arrive, during which time Vin kept her company, sharing stories and offering words of encouragement. By the time the officers pulled up in their patrol car, Mrs. Harper felt a renewed sense of safety and hope. Thanks to Vin's intervention, justice would be served, not just for her, but for the entire neighborhood. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the events of the afternoon began to settle into memory. But one thing was certain. Life in the quiet little suburb would never quite be the same again. And for Mrs. Harper, knowing that someone like Vin Diesel had stood by her side made all the difference in the world. After handing Mrs. Harper her purse and ensuring she was comfortable, Vin Diesel wasted no time in taking the next steps to address the situation. He knew that confronting the boys directly had been an important part of teaching them a lesson, but it wasn't enough. For justice to truly be served and for the neighborhood to feel safe again, the authorities needed to get involved. With that in mind, Vin pulled out his phone and dialed 911, reporting the incident with as much detail as possible. While waiting for the police to arrive, Vin stayed by Mrs. Harper's side, offering quiet reassurance and keeping her spirits up. Though she was visibly shaken, her gratitude toward him was evident in every word she spoke. "I don't know how I can ever thank you," she said softly, clutching her purse tightly as if afraid it might disappear again. "You didn't have to do any of this." Vin smiled warmly, his deep voice carrying a comforting tone. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "Because what they did was wrong. And when something's wrong, we fix it. That's just how it works." His words seemed to resonate with her, bringing a flicker of strength back into her eyes. She nodded, slowly, appreciating not only his actions but also the way he carried himself, calm, confident, and compassionate. It was clear that Vin wasn't just there to help retrieve a stolen item. He genuinely cared about making things right. When the police arrived a short while later, their presence brought a sense of order to the scene. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, their uniforms crisp and their expressions professional, yet approachable. As soon as they spotted Vin standing beside Mrs. Harper, one of them, a tall officer with salt and pepper hair, did a double take. "Wait a minute, is that Vin Diesel?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The other officer, a younger woman with sharp features, followed his gaze and chuckled. "Looks like it," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "This must be my lucky day." Vin greeted them with a polite nod, extending a hand to shake theirs. "Officer," he said, his tone respectful. "Thanks for coming so quickly. We've got a situation here involving theft and harassment. The victim is Mrs. Evelyn Harper." He gestured toward the elderly woman sitting on the bench who waved weakly but managed a small smile. The officers exchanged quick glances before turning their attention to Vin. Clearly, having a Hollywood star report a crime wasn't something they encountered every day. Still, they maintained their professionalism, pulling out notebooks and pens to jot down details. "Can you walk us through what happened?" the older officer asked, addressing both Vin and Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper hesitated, still feeling fragile after the ordeal. Sensing her hesitation, Vin stepped forward, taking charge of the explanation. Mrs. Harper was walking home from her morning stroll when 3 young men approached her near the park. He began, his voice steady and clear. They snatched her purse and pushed her, causing her to stumble. They ran off with her belongings, laughing as they went. I witnessed the incident and followed them to an abandoned lot where I confronted them and retrieved the purse. The officers listened intently, occasionally glancing at Mrs. Harper to confirm the account. When Vin finished speaking, the younger officer turned to the elderly woman. "Is that accurate, ma'am?" she asked gently. Mrs. Harper nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, that's exactly what happened," she confirmed. "I didn't recognize them. They weren't familiar faces, but they were cruel. I've never felt so powerless." The weight of her words hung in the air, prompting a moment of silence. The officers exchanged sympathetic looks, clearly moved by her vulnerability. "We'll do everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen again," the older officer assured her. "Do you remember anything specific about them? Any distinguishing features?" Mrs. Harper thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Not really," she admitted. One of them was tall and lanky, another shorter and stockier, and the third seemed to be the leader. But beyond that— "It's okay, ma'am," the younger officer interjected kindly. "Mr. Diesel mentioned he tracked them down earlier. If he can provide descriptions or better yet, point us in their direction, that should help." At this, Vin stepped forward once more. "Absolutely," he said confidently. "I can take you to where I found them. They're probably still hanging around the area unless they've bolted." The officers nodded, clearly impressed by Vin's willingness to assist. "That would be incredibly helpful," the older officer said. "If you're willing to lead us there, we'll handle the rest." With that decided, Vin turned to Mrs. Harper, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll be back soon," he promised. "Stay here with Officer Lewis. She'll keep you company until we return." He gestured toward the younger officer, who gave Mrs. Harper a warm smile and took a seat beside her. Before leaving, Vin made sure Mrs. Harper had everything she needed: her medication, keys, wallet, all safely tucked away in her purse. Once he was certain she was settled, he joined the officers in their patrol car, directing them toward the abandoned lot where the boys had been hiding earlier. As they drove, the officers couldn't resist peppering Vin with questions about his life, his movies, and how he'd ended up in their quiet little suburb. Vin answered graciously, sharing bits and pieces of his story while keeping the focus on the task at hand. When they reached the lot, the scene was eerily quiet. The boys were nowhere to be seen, but signs of their recent presence lingered: discarded wrappers, footprints in the dirt, and a faint scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Vin pointed out the exact spot where he'd confronted them, describing each boy in detail. The leader was wearing a red hoodie, he recalled. The tall one had messy blonde hair, and the shorter one had a black baseball cap on backward. The officers scribbled notes furiously, committing every detail to memory. "Got it," the older officer said, nodding. "We'll put out an alert and canvass the area. These guys won't stay hidden for long." As they wrapped up their investigation, Vin offered one final piece of advice. "Keep an eye on this place," he suggested. "It seems like a hot spot for troublemakers. Maybe increase patrols or install some lighting. This neighborhood deserves to feel safe." The officers agreed wholeheartedly, promising to follow up on his suggestions. By the time they returned to Mrs. Harper, she looked noticeably calmer, thanks in large part to the younger officer's soothing conversation. Seeing Vin approach, she gave him a grateful smile. "Did you find them?" she asked hopefully. "Not yet," Vin replied honestly. "But the officers are on it. They'll track them down and make sure they face consequences for what they've done." Mrs. Harper nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "Good," she said, firmly. "No one should treat others that way, not anyone." Her words struck a chord with everyone present, reinforcing the importance of accountability and compassion. Before parting ways, Vin knelt beside Mrs. Harper one last time, squeezing her hand gently. "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Harper," he told her earnestly. "Don't let today define you. You've inspired me, and I'm sure you inspire everyone else who knows you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "Thank you, Mr. Diesel," she whispered, "for everything." With that, Vin stood up, exchanging final goodbyes with the officers before heading back to his friend's house. Though the incident had disrupted the tranquility of the neighborhood, it had also sparked something powerful: a renewed sense of community and solidarity. Neighbors who had heard about what happened began checking in on Mrs. Harper, offering support and vowing to look out for one another. Meanwhile, the local news picked up the story, praising Vin for his heroics and highlighting the need for greater vigilance against petty crimes. Days later, the police located the three boys, arresting them on charges of theft and harassment. During questioning, they admitted to targeting Mrs. Harper because they thought she'd be an easy mark. What they hadn't anticipated was crossing paths with someone like Vin Diesel, a man whose physical presence matched his moral integrity. Their arrest served as a reminder that actions have consequences, and even the smallest act of cruelty can ripple outward. affecting lives in ways they never intended. For Vin, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of standing up for what's right. Though he hadn't set out to play the role of a hero that day, he recognized the impact his actions had made, not just for Mrs. Harper, but for the entire neighborhood. As he reflected on the events during a subsequent interview, he summed it up perfectly. Sometimes all it takes is one person stepping in to remind us that kindness, courage, and justice matter. And if I can inspire others to do the same, then that's a legacy worth leaving behind. The confrontation at the abandoned lot unfolded with a swiftness that left everyone stunned. When Vin Diesel stepped into the scene, his towering frame cast an imposing shadow over the three young men who had been rifling through Mrs. Harper's purse moments earlier. They were still huddled near the crumbling brick wall, their smug grins fading as they realized the gravity of the situation. The leader, the one in the red hoodie, was the first to speak up, though his voice wavered under Vin's piercing gaze. "Yo, man, we already gave you the purse," he stammered, holding up his hands defensively. "What else do you want?" Vin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locked onto the trio like a predator sizing up its prey. His silence spoke volumes, radiating an authority that made the boys squirm uncomfortably. Finally, he broke the tension with a simple question. "Do you even understand what you did today?" The boys exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to answer. The lanky one with messy blonde hair tried to play it cool, shrugging nonchalantly. "It was just a prank, dude. No big deal." "A prank?" Vin repeated, his tone calm but laced with disbelief. "You call stealing from an elderly woman, a harmless, defenseless woman, a prank? Do you have any idea how scared she was? How violated she felt?" His words hit hard, cutting through their attempts to downplay the severity of their actions. For a brief moment, guilt flickered across their faces, but pride and fear quickly masked it. The stocky boy in the backward baseball cap muttered something under his breath, though his voice lacked conviction. "We said we're sorry, all right? What more do you want from us?" Vin crossed his arms over his chest, his muscles flexing involuntarily beneath his shirt. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did. Sorry doesn't give back the dignity you stripped away from her. You need to learn that your actions have consequences, not just for others, but for yourselves too." As he spoke, Vin began circling the group, his movements calculated and purposeful. Each step echoed against the concrete ground, amplifying the tension in the air. The boys shifted uneasily, their bravado crumbling under the weight of his presence. None of them dared to move or speak, afraid of provoking him further. Then without warning, Vin sprang into action. It all happened so fast that the boys barely had time to react. The leader, still clutching a crumpled receipt from Mrs. Harper's purse, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of Vin's lightning-quick reflexes. With a swift kick, Vin disarmed him, sending the receipt fluttering to the ground. Before the boy could recover, Vin pivoted smoothly, delivering a precise strike to the wrist of the lanky blonde who had reached out instinctively to grab something, anything, to defend himself. The second boy yelped in pain, stumbling backward, as Vin turned his attention to the third member of the group. The stocky kid in the baseball cap attempted to flee, realizing the tide had turned against them. But Vin was faster. In 2 strides, he closed the distance between them, tackling the boy mid-run and bringing him crashing to the ground with a thud. Dust rose in a cloud around them as the boy groaned, clutching his side and struggling to catch his breath. By the time Vin stood upright again, all 3 boys were sprawled across the dirt, groaning in pain and utterly defeated. Their earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by sheer panic and humiliation. The leader clutched his wrist, wincing as he tried to sit up. "Man, what the hell?" he gasped, his voice trembling. "We weren't gonna hurt nobody." "You already did," Vin shot back, his tone firm but not cruel. "And now you're going to face the consequences." For a few seconds, the only sounds were the boys' labored breathing and the distant chirping of birds overhead. Vin towered above them, his expression unyielding yet strangely compassionate. He wasn't gloating or reveling in their defeat. Instead, he seemed almost disappointed, as if he'd hoped they might rise to the occasion and show some remorse before things escalated this far. When the older officer arrived moments later, accompanied by his partner, the scene was eerily quiet. The officers surveyed the area, taking in the sight of the three subdued teenagers and Vin standing calmly amidst the chaos. "Everything under control here?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow. Vin nodded, gesturing toward the boys. "They're all yours," he said simply. "I've already explained the situation. These are the ones responsible for harassing Mrs. Harper." The officer whistled softly, clearly impressed by the efficiency of the takedown. "Looks like you handled it pretty well yourself," he remarked, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Guess we don't need to worry about resistance at this point." One by one, the officers cuffed the boys, reading them their rights as they hauled them to their feet. The leader protested weakly, insisting they hadn't meant any real harm, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The other two remained silent, their heads bowed in shame as they were led toward the patrol car. As they passed Vin, the stocky boy muttered a quiet apology, though it was unclear whether it was directed at him or at no one in particular. Once the boys were secured in the back seat of the vehicle, the officers turned their attention back to Vin. "Thanks for stepping in," the younger officer said sincerely. "Not every day we get backup from someone like you." Vin shrugged modestly, brushing off the compliment. "Just doing what needed to be done," he replied. "Let's hope this teaches them, and maybe others, a lesson about respecting people." With that, the officers climbed into the patrol car and drove off, leaving Vin alone in the abandoned lot. He stood there for a moment, surveying the debris scattered around him, discarded wrappers, cigarette butts, and remnants of the boys' earlier antics. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, a pang of sadness lingered in his chest. These were kids, after all, misguided and reckless, but still capable of change if given the right guidance. Shaking off the thought, Vin retrieved the last remaining items from Mrs. Harper's purse that had fallen during the scuffle. He tucked them carefully into the bag, ensuring nothing was left behind. Then, with a final glance at the desolate space, he turned and walked away, heading back toward the neighborhood where Mrs. Harper awaited news of the outcome. Word of the takedown spread quickly among the residents. By the time Vin returned to the bench where Mrs. Harper sat with Officer Lewis, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Neighbors whispered excitedly, pointing toward Vin as he approached. Some clapped softly while others offered heartfelt thanks for his intervention. Mrs. Harper, still seated but looking considerably brighter than before, beamed at him with gratitude. "You really did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You stopped them." Vin smiled warmly, handing her the purse once more for safekeeping. "We stopped them together," he corrected gently. "You showed incredible courage today, Mrs. Harper. Don't forget that." Her cheeks flushed with pride and she nodded, clutching the purse tightly. "I'll never forget this day or your kindness," she added earnestly. "Thank you, Mr. Diesel." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the neighborhood, a sense of peace returned to the streets. Though the incident would remain etched in everyone's memory, it also sparked something positive, a renewed commitment to looking out for one another and standing up against injustice. For Vin, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the power of action, however small, to create meaningful change. And for Mrs. Harper, it reminded her that even in moments of vulnerability, strength could be found, not just within herself, but in the kindness of strangers willing to lend a hand. That evening, as Vin reflected on the events, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and a community had come together in the face of adversity. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of bravery could leave the most lasting impact.